the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
At CommBank, we're always looking for ways to help small business. That's why we've made this ad for Stephen Dyer, who owns Clay Cups. Stephen's probably in the workshop now making sustainable ceramic coffee cups. As well as this ad, that's Clay Cups, by the way, we've made something else Stephen will like. Real-time smart alerts for when his balance is high, low, and when important payments arrive. Smart alerts, always on, just like you, Stephen. For however you do business, with CommBank, you can.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Pleased to say hello to Dr. Karl. Hello, Dr. Karl.
Hello, Dr. Rhod. How fabulous to talk with you again.
It's lovely to have you with us too. And I know that after all the excitement of the election, everything's just calming down, and you're going to talk to us about coal in a minute. And then I'll ask you to introduce a guest who I believe that you have sitting beside you.
The election, yes, look, I was deeply disturbed by the Eurovision voting. I mean, giving away blocks of 12 votes at a time, how can they do that?
That's very politic of you. Okay, tell us about coal, because, you know, we all think that coal is going out of fashion, but it keeps on being produced.
It is. I've been reading up on it. Just to update myself, when somebody asked me a question about the difference between brown coal and black coal, right, I suddenly realised that I didn't have the facts at my fingertips.
The chemical answer, because I always think, well, all I know about brown coal is it's dirty coal. You know, it's not as clean. If there's that clean coal, it's a very sooty burning coal.
That's right. So if you go to your very highest grade of coal, something like anthracite, you've got virtually 99.9% carbon, and when you burn it, all you get is carbon dioxide and maybe a little bit of other stuff from, you know, the residue. But in brown coal, you can have more than 50% of it being not coal. And that can be water. You can have the water content as high as 60 or 70%, and all sorts of volatiles. So think of it as a kind of a peat. So it's not vegetable, and it's not pure carbon. It's on the way in between. So depending on the energy content, depending on the ratio of the water content and the volatiles, brown coal delivers about half the energy per kilogram of black coal. But in Australia, we've got a higher water content, so we get 1/3. There are costs associated with the burning of it. You get air pollution, and in Australia it works out to $0.8 billion in terms of health costs associated with burning brown coal, and then loss of productivity. Worldwide subsidies to coal in 2015 were about $2.5 trillion, which is about 3% of the world's gross domestic product of about $70 or $80 billion. So coal actually gets paid money on top of the profits that they make for some reason. Coal provides 25% of the world's energy as of now, 40% of the world's electricity, and it's the largest single source of carbon dioxide, and in 2016 it accounted for 40% of carbon dioxide emissions. And in the case of the United Kingdom, I believe a week or two ago, you actually managed to make all your electricity without burning any coal at all.
For about 10 days, I think.
Other things. Yes. So nuclear, natural gas, and a small amount of renewables, which are gradually ramping up.
And hydro.
And hydro. Yeah, so that's sort of like a snapshot of where we stand now, and then different parts of the world accept or deny the science of climate change. So that seems to be weird. It's like saying, I will, because of my political affiliation, I will accept the 2 times table as being a perfectly reasonable 2 times table. The 7 times table, my political party tells me that that's not real, so I don't accept it. Which is kind of hard for me coming from a scientific background.
I want, by the way, before you go on, several of our very alert listeners noticed you on the television in Australia, and one of them at least claims that you were crying. David says that was a very moving episode of Who Do You Think You Are last night. He says, I cried along with you, I'm not normally the sort who is prone to outbursts of uncontrollable weeping, but then I'm recovering from a stroke, so that might explain it. What did you do that caused you to tear up like that?
Well, it was the emotional experience of being on this little rail platform, and it was only about, look, it was shorter than an Olympic swimming pool. It was maybe 30 metres long, and it was not even 2 metres wide. It was just a skinny little rail platform, and from that rail platform, several 100,000 people were sent to death camps to be burnt and turned into carbon dioxide and water. And knowing that my grandmother and my mother had both been on this actual platform just filled me with emotion to know that, you know, half a century earlier, this is where they had been, and my grandmother got killed. My mother managed by all sorts of luck to sort of scrape through and not get killed. And so that just filled me with such emotion, thinking, how could we as humans do that to our fellow humans, to deliberately kill them and then burn them to remove all the evidence? And then there was that personal element. It was my first time. I haven't been inside a concentration camp where they've had the death camps, like Auschwitz. I've been in the ones which were just sort of holding camps, where people died anyway, but not the ones which were specifically set up as a machine to eradicate humans. I just found even the railway platform so moving.
I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, because I think those of us who have never had the experience of having that in our families can't know what it's like.
Well, it's hard, but then on the other hand, there was the Armenian genocide in the early part of the century, Pol Pot, 3 million people in Cambodia, while the majority of the governments of the world supported him, including Australia, while he killed 3 million people for crimes such as little as having a high school education or wearing glasses. Wearing glasses was enough to have you killed. So we just have to make sure that we don't do it again.
Yeah. Anyway, did you learn things about your family when you'd finished the program? Did you know more about who your family were?
It was astonishing. My father was a journalist, and I know this is nothing to do with the ABC or the BBC, but some journalists are perhaps prone to exaggerating or picking a slant where they sort of big things up a little bit, amplify things. And my father told me stories, and I thought he was just exaggerating, but in fact he was under-exaggerating. What's the opposite of exaggerating? He was humbling himself. Yeah. So on 3 occasions he avoided getting killed. On one occasion he was on a railway platform about to be loaded into some cattle trucks to go to Siberia for a 15-year jail sentence, and the Russian soldiers just looked in the other direction, so he ran, and he got away with it. My God, from Ukraine. Wow, lucky him. And then he walked his way across Europe to Lithuania, got busted by the Russian police at the border, thrown into a Russian camp, was there for about 1.5 years, and was about to be sent off to Siberia again for the second time, when the Nazis, conveniently for him, declared war on Russia and bombed the camp that he was in, the jail, and blew away the wall. And suddenly there was no wall holding him in, so the second time he did a runner, and then the third time at Sachsenhausen he was able to swap identities with somebody who was already dead with the bribe of a tin of sardines that he'd hung on to for a long time. So he actually was, his stories were amazing, whereas my mother, I found out to my surprise that she had lied to me to get away from the terrible stress of what it was like to be in a war and having people trying to kill you for no reason other than the fact that that was their job and your job was to be the victim. And so she completely changed her identity. She changed her name from Rivka to Rena. She changed her date of birth so that she could be with her sister in the concentration camps. She changed. I always thought as a child that she was a Swedish person of Swedish birth who was of the Lutheran faith. And it turned out that she was a Jewish person born in Łódź in Poland. Complete lies. But we're still going to see it now, but you and I, because there are soldiers, there are people coming back in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Australia, coming back from war service in Iran, in Iraq. And some of them will have seen terrible, terrible things, and they'll just try to cover it up. whichever way they can. At least now we've got a little bit of more of an understanding about post-traumatic stress disorder. But in many cases, we just have the soldiers broken by what's happened to them, both male and female, and we don't try to fix them up again. And so my mother went through that as well. So her way of coping was just to tell lies about it. And I fully appreciate if that worked for her, good on her.
Yeah. Well, we'd love to have your calls. 08085 909 693, UpAllNight, bbc.co.uk, or 85058 if you are texting us, and we'll get to those in just a moment. But do tell us about your guests.
Well, autism. Autism is such a big thing as compared to what it was 30 years ago. Let me introduce to the microphone almost doctor, not quite, doing a PhD, and
Marigliano,
who's studying a PhD. So take us through it. Is autism real? Is it increasing? Rhod, over to you.
So autism is definitely real. So it's diagnosed based on difficulties with social communication, so problems reading other people's emotions and responding appropriately, and restricted and repetitive behaviours or interests. So this can be just a very obsessive interest in something or a need to follow routines. Whether it's increasing is a subject of debate that I don't actually have the answer to. It seems to be increasing in diagnosis, but it may just be that we know much more about it and we recognise it, especially in people who don't have big struggles. And also previously the stigma around autism would have been much higher, so people would have been much more reluctant to get a diagnosis. And they've changed the diagnostic criteria. So there's lots of factors that are potentially contributing to the increase in the diagnosis of autism, including changing the definition of it.
That's very interesting. Hello, it's lovely to have you with us, Marlene. I was just thinking about, I was reading a book earlier this week about Field Marshal Montgomery, who's a great wartime commander, and the writer said that having spoken to several people, Monty's behaviour and doing things like making sure that nobody smoked around him could place him on the spectrum. That seemed to be quite weak, and I just wonder if we're placing too many people on the spectrum these days, of autism.
And I think that definitely could be the case, and I think particularly in historical figures you see, these subtle signs and you think, oh, well, that's indicative of autism, while without having a full characterization of the person in their early development, you can't really diagnose posthumously.
Okay, let me ask you one then. What about an airline pilot? So one thing you want in an airline pilot is some of the things you mentioned. Exact behaviour, repetitive behaviour. So when the airline pilot gets in the cockpit, they read the checklist, they go through everything, there's no light chit-chat, they're just making sure the job is done the same way every time. What do you reckon?
I think it could be a good fit for some people with autism. Like that, that sort of routine-based skills can often be a really good fit for people who have autism.
Rhod?
Right. Well, I very much look forward to your questions for Marlena. If you've got questions on autism. Meanwhile, let's just fling a couple out there for you, Dr. Karl. This is kind of nice news. Our friend Serena in Handsworth Wood in Birmingham writes later on today, and she's writing this morning, later on today it's my last exam for my master's degree in chemistry at the University of Birmingham. After the summer, says Serena, my plan is to start a PhD in the same department on the synthesis of organic fluorescent molecules to tag antibodies. You'll have to explain that to me, Dr. Karl. But Serena says, do you have any advice for me and for anybody who is contemplating studying science at university level and beyond?
Okay, I'll do the first part, then Marigliano, if you wish. Organic fluorescent molecules. So sometimes you want to see if there's a molecule in an area of interest. It might be the kidney in a living creature. It might be some cells on a laboratory bench. So what you can do is get a chemical which will then stick to a fluorescent molecule that will light up when you hit it, for example, with ultraviolet light. So one end of it sticks to the fluorescent chemical, and the other end sticks to the area of interest. And so suddenly, if certain chemicals appear in kidney cells, then they will then attract these marked chemicals which are lying around, which will then light up. They'll change shape, and then the fluorescent molecule will light up. So it's a way of seeing the presence, the local presence of other chemicals that you want. And so the fluorescent chemical is used as a marker to shine a light. But is it a good thing, though, Marigliano, to go straight from your master's to a PhD? Is it a bad thing? Advantages, disadvantages?
I mean, I think there's probably advantages and disadvantages to it. I think there's something to be said for working with someone, if you're committing to doing a PhD, which can take many years, to knowing that you work well within the group, because science is rarely an isolated experience. You're generally working within a team. So if you know that you have this team that you like working with and this area that you find really interesting, I would recommend that. I think feeling really interested in what you're doing the science about is really key when you do a PhD. I think, caring and seeing the point of what you're doing is very valuable and brings a lot of motivation for it.
So with your first point, I believe that having a supervisor who's simpatico in many different ways, professionally, etc., is wonderful if it works out well and terrible if it doesn't. So if you found one, Serena, that works for you, what would you recommend there, Marigliano?
I think stick with it if you are enjoying what you do.
There we go. Advice from somebody who's been on the pathway.
Right. And from us all, Serena, very good luck in the morning with the exam, but knowing you as we do from your questions, I'm sure it's all going to go very, very well. Thank you. Jeff wants to know, Marigliano, your first question, if you care to. Jeff wants to know, what's the difference between low and high autism?
So the recent diagnostic criteria actually got rid of low and high autism because they found that it didn't actually describe that much meaningful in someone's presentation. It was used to kind of mean the level of impairment seen in the person with autism. So if someone had low functioning autism, they may struggle to speak, or they would be very, very distressed by changes in routine, while someone high functioning is often what we tend to diagnose those famous people we talked about previously, that the level of impairment is less. So they've actually moved to change the diagnostic criteria to have specifiers of autism with or without an intellectual disability, or autism with a verbal ability to speak or without, because they thought that was clinically more meaningful.
Well, you learn something every day.
Thank you, Jeff, for that question. Let's bring in David, who's calling us from Leeds. Hello, David.
Good morning, mighty doctors. First of all, what an astonishing tale about the camps in Germany in this case. I have a two-part question. It's about farming and soil. A while back on the BBC, I heard, must have been one of the science programs somewhere, saying that within 100 years, the soil on the planet will have degraded so much in condition and fertility that it's going to be virtually useless. And part two of the question I heard on a good read, someone quoting from a book by the person who owns and runs the company, I think it's Patagonia, and in the last part of the book he states that since the Second World War the nutritional value of vegetables has gone down 80%. I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts about those two things.
Well, with regard to that first quote, that the soil has become degraded and may well lead to be unusable within a century, I read a report on that and was convinced enough by it on a superficial level to actually put it into my last book. And then I think I'm wrong. I think I made a mistake. I was listening to that fine BBC show, More or Less, with Tim Harcourt, and he looked at that quote and then called in, which I should have done and did not, a whole bunch of soil scientists, and they could not find the basis for that. It is a claim that has been made, but when they got the proper soil scientists in, they couldn't find where it first came from or any justification for believing in it from the soil scientists themselves. So I'm going back and re-evaluating that, and I'm going to have to chase that up more deeply. So I'm now I think I might have made a mistake. I may well have made a mistake. The soil could last longer than a century, although we are pushing it hard. Secondly, I have read this factoid about the nutrients in our fruit and our vegetables dropping, and the figure I've heard is 10% up to 80%. I can't believe 80%. I'm not a soil scientist. We'd need an agricultural scientist who specialises in this area. I haven't read the report, so I can't comment any further, but it's something that we have to be careful that we don't get suckered into automatically accepting, even if it comes from a good source such as the ABC or the BBC, because it could still be wrong. So still chasing up on both of those. I really want to know myself, David, and if there's somebody listening now, oh, by the way, Rhod, the magic number that they should ring if they happen to be listening, and also what are the ways of contacting us?
08085 909 693, the number that David came through on. Anything to add, David?
No, apart from many thanks.
Thank you very much. I mean, I'm an amateur gardener, and every year I go off and visit my friend who keeps alpacas, and I get some very, very fine poop from her, which I then dig into my my plot that my father did and his father did before him, and you know, I can grow. I hate to say that, but I can grow potatoes on my land year after year because I feed it so much. I know that's not best practice. I know I'm supposed to rotate, but between, you know, feeding and top dressing and so on, I don't think my soil is being degraded at all. I stand to be corrected if there's a soil scientist out there who wants to come and upbraid me for doing such an irresponsible thing.
I follow your lead. I've been turning vegetable into compost for years, and this year for the first time I've actually started growing something, starting off with something like a volunteer tomato, which I don't think, well, I have 5 of them, I don't think they'll make it through the winter. Apparently if the temperature gets below 16 they don't like it, but I've been getting tremendous growth, and I've been following your habit of re-fertilising the soil with a whole bunch of things, in your case llama poo and whatever else you can find. So I think that if you do it with a variety of sources, that's different from just feeding them with a monoculture of whatever they happen to buy from the supermarket in 40-kilogram bags.
Yeah, I'm sure we're lucky because we've got a variety of things available to us. You know, we can put on crushed shellfish sometimes, for example, which is very good for the soil. It really helps. So, anybody else, any farmers who are getting up around this time and would like to communicate with us on the subject of soil exhaustion, I think that'd be really interesting. So, what else? This is from Dr. Heather. She says, if one were able to hit a cricket ball so far that it escaped Earth's gravitational force and headed off into space, what would happen to that ball if it had spin or didn't have spin? Would it make a difference in a vacuum?
It should not make a difference unless you're getting into a gyroscopic effect. But if you're in a vacuum far away from the gravitational influences of any other planets, you're basically following Newton's first law, which says that an object will keep on doing whatever it's doing unless a force acts upon it. So it'll keep on going, following the fabric of space-time, and if it's spinning, it'll keep on spinning unless it runs into molecules that hit the outside and therefore take away some of that angular momentum. But if it doesn't run into anything, if it's a pure vacuum, it'll keep on spinning and keep on going in a straight line across the fabric of space-time until it hits the edge of the universe. I don't know what will happen then. It'll probably keep on going.
Marlena, we have a couple of questions for you now. This is one from somebody who has tested online. I'll just read you what they say. They say they're undiagnosed because under the International Health there is a 2.5-year waiting list, but has hit high percentile in online autism tests. I seem to fit the pathological demand avoidance type, but that's just me guessing. Is there a good online site you could recommend, Marigliano, that might help our listener in some way?
Nothing online that I can think of. I think it's very difficult for online measures to capture the full range of developmental experience, so your early childhood experience, in order to receive a diagnosis. So unfortunately, I think the NHS is probably your best answer, but you can think about it and you can, unfortunately there's nothing online that I would recommend.
Sorry for that. Okay.
Sorry.
So stay in the queue.
Yeah.
Stay in the queue for a specialist, for somebody to see you. Okay. This is from Swan in Cumbria, who says Western women are tending to have babies in their 30s and even later. Is that likely to increase the chances of autism?
So the evidence actually seems to suggest that older fathers has a bigger influence than older mothers in the risk of autism, but it's very small still. So there's lots of little risks that we know, but it seems that they have to add up to a certain amount to create a diagnosis. So there is some risk factors that have been associated with autism. So advanced paternal age, seems to be one, but mothers does not seem to have that effect.
So young women should avoid going out with older men, should they?
Yes.
Well, thank you for that. That's really helpful. Okay, let's carry on. This is for you, Dr. Karl. This is from Paul, who says, "Could Dr. Karl settle an argument? My dad raised a question about golf. When a golf ball is struck, at what point is the ball at maximum speed? My uncle argues it must be at the exact moment it leaves the golf club, as at that point there is no longer any force acting on it to speed it up. My dad thinks it must be later than this, as it can't accelerate due to top speed in no distance at all. I know the ball speed's higher than the club swing speed. Presumably this is due to the compression of the ball, adding some force."
I remember seeing some lovely still photographs taken by high-speed strobe of where the golf club, hits the ball and the ball stays still where it is. It doesn't retreat from the advancing head, but instead distorts and wraps itself around the head, and then it springs off. So it changes itself from a ball into a flattened thing wrapped around the golf club head, and then it springs back to the circular shape, the spherical shape. And there is your restoring force. You've got two forces acting. You've got the forward motion of the golf club head through the air, roughly, you hope, in the direction of where you want the ball to go, plus you've got the spring of the golf ball against the head. At the exact instance when there is nothing touching the golf club head, it has achieved its maximum velocity. All the force that could be possibly imparted to the ball has been imparted. That's the forward motion of the golf club plus the rebounding. The moment that it has left the golf club head and then proceeds away, there's no more forces acting to accelerate it. All you've got is forces to slow it down, such as wind resistance. Yeah.
Right. So the split second when it resumes its normal shape and actually leaves the ball, the club head.
That's right. When the ball is, say, a millimetre, a tenth of a millimetre away from the club head, and it's not going to be touching it anymore, at that speed it has reached its maximum velocity, when it's just off the golf club head. Mm-hmm. And then there's no other forces acting to accelerate it, only forces to slow it down, like wind resistance.
So it sounds...
Gravity, when it comes, if you do a terrible shot and it goes up in the air and then comes back down, is there a point where it could go high enough in the air that coming back down it would get speed up?
When you fire a bullet into the air from a gun, you can leave the barrel of a gun at 1,000, or if you've got a high kilometres an hour, or if you've got a high-powered hunting rifle at, say, a few thousand, but coming down, you can reach only 200 kilometres an hour. So the gravity will be sucking, but the wind resistance won't help it. Look, there is one way it can go faster. If you do, thank you for that, Marigliano, if you do your golf club hit on the very edge of a very steep cliff, and you're on a ramp and you're hitting it downhill. So if you're hitting it horizontally, it'll slow down. If you're hitting it slightly upwards, it'll slow down. But if you're hitting it downhill, it might actually pick up a little bit of extra speed from gravity. That's kind of it. In general, the moment that it stopped interacting physically with the golf club head, that is when it has already reached its maximum speed, and everything is downhill, slowing down after that.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to tell Paul then that his dad owes his uncle a drink, because it sounds like his uncle is on the money when he says it's the exact moment it leaves the golf club.
Ah, very perceptive.
Very perceptive. Super. Okay, let's take a call from Doris, who's in Norfolk. Hello, Doris.
Yes, good morning. Nice to speak to you. I've been trying for 2 weeks to get through to you, look.
Well, thank you for trying and continuing to try.
But this is well, I think it's a little bit unusual. I can't get my head round it. This would be back in the 1980s at 6 o'clock on a Sunday evening. And the sun, well, I guess it was the sun, was setting in the east, but very, very, very slightly north. Now, that looked like that was just sitting on the ground. It was so big, and a reddy, bright orangey red, and I can't quite get my head around what was happening there. So would it be the sun?
Well, it looks similar to the sun, but it was in the east at the end of the day, not the west. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
In other words, it's on the opposite side of the sky.
Yes.
Right. I have noticed something which I've been meaning to ask my friends in meteorology about the so-called anti-solar point. So as the sun is setting in the west, you'll see that in that part of the sky, depending on the local weather of the day and the cloud cover and all that sort of stuff, you'll see a generalised redness. And then, if you swing your eyes to the north and the south, you'll just see blueness. But if you go to the anti-solar point, 180 degrees away from the sun, over on the east side, you'll see redness again.
That was that was nearly red. And that looked like that was sitting on the ground.
I can't imagine what it would be, but I do fully acknowledge that you do get something happening at the so-called anti-solar point, which is opposite in the sky from wherever the sun happens to be. There's differences in the shade of blue during the day, but let's not even go there. So there's a definite redness at the end of the day in the east, even though there's no redness to the north and south. But to ramp that up to the next stage, where you get an image of a ball, the best I can think of is to go looking, which I've got this book at the office. It's called Light and Colour in the Great Outdoors, written by Minaert, Minnaert, and he has got a vast compendium, collection of all of the strange atmospheric phenomena that he's been able to find over the last century or so, and has got explanations for them where there's one available. If somebody's got an explanation, if there's a meteorologist listening, please ring in.
Can I come in with something here from our good friend Paul in Shropshire, who says, Doris, you saw the moon. He says you saw a big, orange, bright, full moon. That's Paul's diagnosis.
Really?
Yeah, because of all the atmospherics. Sorry,
I think he could be right. It's ridiculously simple. But, and I went down a blind pathway myself. Was it a full moon? Can you remember back that far? That's the question, because the full moon is enormously bright.
That was really a full, whatever, sun or moon or whatever, and that looked like that was sitting on the ground, and that was so big. I'd never seen anything like it before.
But that's exactly how the moon rises, especially if it's a harvest moon. Some of these big red harvest moons.
That was the daylight is just about gone. The daylight is just about gone. That was like, we call it dusk.
Yes. Well, there you are. It's a good time. It depends. Do you remember what month this was?
September.
It was September. It was a harvest moon then.
Oh,
Wow.
That I think is what Paul is saying. It's a harvest moon.
that was September, late September, I would think. Oh my
Well,
goodness.
super. There's a nice thing to see. Isn't it lovely?
Yes, I went in and picked up this elderly couple to take them to church, and by the time I came out, that had gone. So how long that had been there before I got to go and pick them up, like to when I saw them. And when they came out in about 5 minutes, that had gone. That disappeared completely.
Could be behind clouds. I'm going, in the absence of anything better, I'm going with Paul, but
Yes.
there might be something different. But thank you.
Yeah, well, that
I
looks
reckon
like
that's
that's
it.
sitting on the ground.
Doris, thanks very much. Lovely to talk to you.
Thank you too. Thank you for Paul phoning in as well. Thank you.
Will do. Here's a wee note, by the way, on autism, and maybe Marlena would like to comment on this first, because it's from Anne, somewhere in Scotland, and she says possibly older men could be autistic and not had relationships before. Very often there's a genetic link, and she said it's sad to hear you speak of risk of autism. We have old-fashioned values of accurate routine work, exceptional memories, no ego. And many scientists in history would now be diagnosed as autistic. And also there are private diagnosis places which are worth paying for, I would advise. So that's to our earlier texter who said, what can I do? Can I go online? Anne says there are private clinics where you could be diagnosed. She's talking about stigma, Marlena. Is that something that you would like to talk a little bit about too?
I apologise for my language in there. That is generally how we talk about the genetic studies that will draw links between certain experiences and the experience of autism. Obviously, everyone's experience of autism is very different, and some people, everyone's experience of autism is very different.
And risk does sort of make it sound like a very bad thing. Although if you have difficulty in communicating with your fellow human, that can in some cases be a negative thing.
Okay, let's see what we can do. I think that we have some more callers waiting to talk to us. So here's one. Here's another question. Marlena, you're getting a lot of hits tonight. So Richard is calling from somewhere in New South Wales. Hello, Richard.
Hello, doctors. I'm calling from Queanbeyan in New South Wales.
Queanbeyan.
Which Queanbeyan. Yeah, Dr. Karl will probably know it as the gateway to Canberra.
Just outside our capital city.
Very good. Well, Richard, over to you.
Okay, so I've got a question for Dr. Marlena. My son's 14 and has fairly recently been diagnosed with autism. And we were told that there's a sort of scale of 1, 2 and 3, and he's number 2, so in the middle. And he often becomes uncommunicative and will just hide under his duvet, and then refuses to go out, but particularly go to school. I was just wondering if you had any ideas of ways that we could get him to go particularly to school, because I'm concerned that he's missing so much class time.
So I'll begin with saying I'm not a psychologist or a clinician in this area, and that this may be better suited for someone with that expertise. I think one of the things I've personally found as beneficial for people with autism that are struggling to complete a certain task is using likeness of routines, and maybe trying to create a structured routine that proceeds with, steps by step. Some people really like having pictures of each step, and they can kind of tick them off and find just even ticking off each step very motivating. So I don't know if something like that would be beneficial.
Okay, well, it's certainly worth a try. Brilliant, thank you.
No worries.
Okay,
Good luck.
we'll try it out.
Well, Richard, thank you for calling all that way. That's very nice of you to do that. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, bye.
Bye-bye. Now, Jeff asks, this is a kind of a high-level carbon question. Dr. Karl, what's the difference between coal and oil, assuming that they both come from plants, from the degeneration of plants over time?
So coal can run on a spectrum, anything from just plain old vegetable matter that's been in the ground for an hour, and that's definitely not even peat, and then you give it periods of time heading into the thousands and tens of thousands and then millions and tens of millions of years, up to hundreds of millions of years, and you work your way along from highly vegetable matter into peat, into brown coal, and then finally to black coal. Black coal is essentially just carbon. That's it. You look in there, the only atoms that are there are carbon atoms. 99.9% of all the atoms are carbon, and you burn that and you just get plain carbon dioxide. But with oil, you also have in there atoms of oxygen and of hydrogen. So when you burn oil, you're getting carbon dioxide produced because the temperature is up and the reaction gives off heat. So the carbon with oxygen gives you carbon dioxide and heat, and then the heat can then kick off the reaction with the hydrogen, where the hydrogen can also burn, and when hydrogen burns, it turns into water. So you're getting energy and you're not making carbon dioxide. So that could be an advantage of oil over just burning coal. However, there is a disadvantage in the sense that oil has chains of truly complex carbon molecules joined together, 5 carbons long, 10, 50, 100, 1,000, and there's all sorts of chemicals in there that we don't know about that could be potentially very useful in terms of multiple-use plastics for the future, completely different from single-use disposable plastics right now. So by burning the oil, we're firstly creating some degree of carbon dioxide, less than with burning coal, because we're getting that extra energy from the water by making water. But secondly, we're throwing away a resource for the future. So is that sort of a little bit of a summary to get you started? Or you want more?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Lovely. By the way, I've got a message here for Phil from Newcastle. Phil, if you could give us a call, and I apologise for this, will you call us back? Because for some reason we can't call you out at the moment. So if you could give us a call back, we can get you on the air before the next, 7 minutes have elapsed. Jeff wants to know, how far, I'm assuming this is another Jeff, how far has the solar system migrated from where it first began to form?
Well, where we are in the Milky Way, I think it's of the order of 200 and 250 million years for the Sun and the associated solar system to do a complete orbit around the centre of gravity of our galaxy, which is pretty close to that black hole in the middle. And so we would have done in 1 billion years 4 rotations, or 4 orbits, in 4 billion years 16, 4.5 billion years 18. So we've done 18 orbits roughly around the centre of gravity of the Milky Way, and then the whole thing's rotating like a rigid plate, so that there are other objects that have come closer to us and have moved away. So rewinding the clock back of the field called Galactic archaeology, we've been able to find our sun and roughly another 100 or so stars that by their chemical makeup and their age seem to have come from the same stellar nursery 4.7 billion years ago. And some of them have migrated a fair way from us, and some are not so far. And of course, the ones that have migrated a long, long way away from us, we can't see them, so we can't include them in our equations. So that gives you some idea of the complexity of where our solar system is compared to where it was when it started off 4.5 billion years or 18 orbits of the Milky Way ago.
But isn't that interesting? Because I tend to think about the Milky Way and the spiral arms as a bit like a Catherine wheel. But the thing about a Catherine wheel is it's rotating around a fixed point. which is the pin that you put in the middle and pin to the fence. Now you're saying that the Milky Way is kind of spinning, but in a slightly looser way than that.
It is. I was wrong on this one. I was glad that it was brought to my attention. So I thought that it kind of spun like a solid plate, but in fact, all of the stars orbit at around 200 kilometres per second, plus or minus 10 or 20%. Quite different from quite a range, because they're further away from the gravitational suck of the big sun in the middle. Glad that it was brought to my attention. So I thought that it kind of spun like a solid plate, but in fact, all of the stars orbit at around 200 kilometres per second, plus or minus 10 or 20%. Quite different from in our solar system, where Mercury is whizzing around, I think, 50 kilometres a second, and Earth is 30, and Pluto is, I don't know, 20 or something, or 10. So there's quite a range, because they're further away from the gravitational suck of the big sun in the middle, which accounts for about 99.9% of the mass of our solar system. In the case of the Milky Way, we've got 90%, 80% of the matter as invisible dark matter, seemingly evenly scattered all the way through, and so we end up with the stars close in to the centre, and medium way out and a long way out, all moving at roughly 200 kilometres per second, plus or minus 10% or so. So the speed at which the time taken for a complete orbit with the centre depends on whether you're close in or far away from that big black hole in the middle.
I'm glad to say we've got Phil in Newcastle on the line. So in the few minutes that are left, let's listen to Phil. Hello, Phil.
Oh, hello there.
Welcome, Dr. Phil.
Hiya. Right. At the minute, we've just heard British Steel is going to go into administration. Well, it's in administration now. Now, I'm from steel country, but never worked in industry, but I've always been told this, I don't know if it's an urban myth or not, it's you can't mothball blast furnaces. So you've got to run them all year round, every second of the day, but if you can't just suddenly sell up, shut the furnaces down for a week or 2 weeks or a year or whatever, and then start them back up again. You just can't. Why? Have you ever heard anything like that before?
I have, when I was working at the steelworks, but I'm not a metallurgist.
How high is that?
Yeah, well, the steelwork blast furnace could be 100 metres high, and you have in there iron ore, and what you're trying to do is get rid of the oxygen. Iron ore, FeO or Fe2O3. You're trying to split off the oxygen atoms from the carbon atoms. And what you do is you get some coal, and then you get pure coal. It's called coking coal, very pure carbon, and then you heat it up, and you do so in the absence of oxygen, so it doesn't turn into carbon dioxide, but it changes its state and becomes more porous, more open, which is an advantage in the combustion process that is about to happen, and it gets much greater strength, becomes quite stiff. And then you tip it into the blast furnace. You just have rail cars, and you just tip in the coke and the iron ore, and I'm sure there's a few other things as well, and then you start it going. You start heating it up, and luckily it's already hot from the bottom, so the process then, as you tap the liquid ore off at the bottom, then more of the stuff that you've got at the top comes down, and you've got two bells at the top that trap the gases inside and trap the heat inside, and so the coke has to be strong enough to not squash and not break and not fragment, and be able to provide a little bit of an airspace so you can have burning of where you have the reaction that the oxygen comes out of the iron oxide, goes over to the coke and forms carbon dioxide, and then you're left with carbon dioxide and iron. And if you just switch it off, well, the whole thing just solidifies into a solid lump. You've got to try and run it dry, but if you're running it dry and getting all of the iron, liquid iron out, well, there's some that's almost liquid that won't run, and if you switch the blast furnace off, you stop it running, it just goes solid.
Phil, thank you for your question. Marlena and Dr. Karl, thank you for being with us, and congratulations to John and Darvel, who took some very good advice and text us about it.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Hey, do you suffer from sympathy skewing? Seeing vomit, having a vomit, seeing more vomit, having a cheeky vom. Sounds like hell. And what happens to your insides when you have an organ removed? And here's another one for you. How are computer viruses real viruses? All this and so much more coming up in this episode of Science with Dr. Karl. I'm Linda Marigliano. Let's get into it. We're going to kick things off in Adelaide this week with Dr. Dylan. What's up, Dylan? What's your question?
Oh, g'day. I've got a question regarding butterflies. Can butterflies remember when they were caterpillars?
We think they can, in the sense that they can remember things that were bad. So it's not as though they think, gee, I woke up and here I am, a little caterpillar crawling around, and look, there's a nice red car, I like that, and then they like it again when they're adults. But if you do mean things to them, like give them chemicals that taste bad, like I think caffeine they don't like, so you give them some caffeine, they go, ugh, they really run away from it, and they build up a resistance to it. Then if, when they're a butterfly and they get the merest hint of it, they seem to remember they didn't like it from when they were a caterpillar, a completely different shape. So they've turned from this little squoggy little bunch of blobber with legs and stuff into a pretty thing with wings, and they still remember what they were conditioned to dislike. We don't know exactly how they do that.
Yeah, or why they would do that.
Or why they do it. Also, we find in some cases, I think they're called planetaria worms. If you get some planetaria worms and then you teach them something and then chop them up and feed them to other planetaria worms, some of the things go across. But not not very complicated things, not like how to do your homework or what is the role of the moon in Shakespearean literature, but you know, being scared of electric shock.
Wow,
that sort of thing.
What a question. Thank you, Dr. Dylan. Dr. Ashley from Cremorne in Tasmania, what is your question for Dr. Karl?
Oh, good morning, doctors. I was just curious as to if my dog's been licking itself or eating its poo, gross, and then comes and licks me, have I got the poo or the bottom licking on me, the germs from it, or has his mouth been able to clean itself? Or what's the period of time that the mouth cleans itself from the germs of the bottom or the poo?
The longer you wait, the cleaner it will get. So the first thing is that we have bacteria all over us, on the outside of our bodies and on the inside, and they make up slightly more than half of the cells that we carry around. Then secondly, these bacteria then mess up with any invading bacteria that come in, and so they'll try and put them down, and normally your skin will keep your skin in good nick by knocking off the incoming bacteria. So in the case of a dog, when it licks its tongue onto its bum and picks up a whole lot of bum and poo germs, if immediately dangling the tongue out of its mouth, not putting it inside the mouth, it then has this tongue hanging out of its mouth and comes over to you and starts licking you, you're getting a pretty high dose of germs, the bacteria, and the particles of feces. But then if it puts the tongue into its mouth and then swishes it around again, there's a saliva production, so then it dilutes down, maybe to 1/10 of what it is after, say, a minute. And then the longer you wait, the lower and lower it gets. In general, it's not considered good to let the dog lick your face. You can pick up all sorts of germs that way. Dog licking the back of your hand is a kind of a thing you do to introduce yourself to a dog, but then you wash your hand afterwards, or you definitely don't lick the back of your hand, and you definitely wash your hands before you eat. So there'll be still tiny traces of bum and poo germs, but they'll be way down after, I guess, 5 minutes or so. I'm just taking a guess.
Thank you for your call, Dr. Ashley. Hey, Jono in Newcastle, you've got a science question for Dr. Karl. Go ahead.
Hey. Yeah, I was wondering what the go was with, like, my ankle. A dog licked it for a bit. Took ages to heal. Anyway, I was on...
Side note. Anyway,
yeah.
Go on.
Anyway, yeah. I was wondering, so me and my housemate were talking about it. So when you boil water to 100 degrees, it kills all the bacteria in the water. But what if you had like rotten milk, right, spoiled milk? Could you boil that to 100 degrees and it still be physically drinkable but just be like rotten in taste?
Ah, okay, so firstly with the germs, most of the germs involved in food poisoning, they get killed above 70 degrees centigrade. That 40 to 70 degrees is a terrible range to leave your food in because the bacteria can grow rapidly and increase their numbers quite rapidly. Above 70 or so, it's considered that most of the germs will die. Most, but not all. So the bacteria that cause botulism, which is where we get that terrible Botox chemical from, the one that on one hand is one of the most devastating nerve poisons known, and on the other hand is used to paralyse parts of people's faces so they don't have wrinkles anymore. That, if it's being heated up, turns itself into a spore which can survive 120 degrees centigrade. And then, when it cools down, it then turns back into a bacterium and it can come and knock you off. So with regard to the bacteria, most overwhelmingly, the vast majority of bacteria will die if you boil them, but the bacteria, the atoms that made up their bodies haven't gone. They're still there, and if they've made a toxin, in most cases that toxin will be broken down, but in some cases it might survive. Now if you're talking about spoiled milk, well, in milk is 88% water, and it's then fat, protein and carbohydrate in roughly 3, 4 and 5%. And those molecules, if they're the carbohydrates, they'll probably survive, the fat will probably survive, the protein will probably get broken down into something else. Now if you've boiled it and made something really bad with the milk, which takes about 20 minutes to do, those chemicals seem to hang around for a long time. So I'm guessing they're rancid fat and something to do with carbohydrate. So the fact that you've killed the germs doesn't mean that you've broken down the putrescent chemicals. They still survive in some cases. Some will break down, some won't.
So it'd still be terrible.
It'd be still vaguely terrible.
Don't do it, Jono. I can smell it from here.
Although I do admire your scientific curiosity.
Nick from Cotton Tree in Queensland. What's your one?
Oh, hi, Dr. Linda, Dr. Karl.
Dr. Nick.
My question is to do with cooking and allergens, like people that are allergic to bread and to seafood. And my question basically is when does the food, when it turns to carbon, or if it does, stop being allergic to people, for people?
So you've got the gluten in bread, and that's actually a bunch of proteins, and proteins are in general, firstly, active because of their shape, and secondly, fairly heat sensitive. If you take them out of their temperature range, they change. However, in an oven, what temperature do you take an oven up to? 180 degrees centigrade, 150 if you're baking some bread, 140, 100 and something.
Nick?
You don't break bread.
No, I don't. I'm bad.
Yeah, no, we cook to about 350 degrees.
Oh, you're a chef. Okay.
Yeah.
So in that case, you're baking it to well over, that's 350 Fahrenheit, I'm guessing.
No, centigrade.
Centigrade?
Yeah, so it's a pizza oven, so it's really hot.
Wow.
So it cooks the pizza in about 3 minutes.
Wow. Okay, but getting back to bread, what temperature do they cook a bread oven up to? 180 or something? 150? I don't know. Yeah, so the point is that the general rule that proteins tend to break apart and denature with temperature doesn't seem to hold with the proteins that are involved in gluten in wheat. They seem to be stable at high temperatures. So would they be stable until you actually burn it, when you char it? I don't know. If we could have a food chemist ring us in. So you're saying if you've got some pizza bread and you've actually burnt it, do the proteins still survive such that they can set off a reaction in somebody who is, say, suffering from celiac disease?
Yeah, and it's something we've always asked, because if we char grill a piece of fish and there's a little piece of fish on there but it's turned to carbon, will that affect somebody and make them allergic, yeah.
If somebody could look that up on Google Scholar, or if we have a food chemist, could you please ring in on the magic number?
Thank you,
that's a
Dr.
good
Nick.
one.
I
Thank
hope we
you.
get to the bottom of it.
Yeah.
Another Dr. Linda, hey, from Mona Vale in New South Wales. You're on Triple J. What is your science question for Dr. Karl?
Hey, Dr. Linda. Hey, Dr. Karl.
Dr. Linda?
Hello, good morning. My science question is, I have a fat cat, Lulu, who is 6 years old, and in the last 3 months, she started snoring. So my question is, 1, why is this happening? And 2, is there anything I can do to help her stop snoring?
When you said fat cat, did you also mean, besides being super cute, that the cat is slightly overweight?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
in humans, that's well known to be associated with snoring. You have an airway through which air passes, and as it comes down, there's tissues on the inside that it can push around. So the outside of the airway has these rings of cartilage, but on the inside there's flesh, which is normally kept in a situation, this location, by muscle tone. When you're asleep, that muscle tone loosens off. If you've got some extra fat in there, then they can wobble around. So for humans who are snoring and who are a bit overweight in some, but not all cases, losing a bit of weight, and that loses just a gram or two along the airway, that can reduce the snoring, and that may be the case with your cat. But I'm not an expert in that. I'd definitely check with your vet, but going from first principles, that's what I'd recommend. Make your cat lose a bit of weight. Sorry.
Sorry, little cat. My friend Selena has a little cat, and she had to put it on a diet because he was going in and eating magnums. Like, worked out how to open up the freezer and
Wow.
would eat magnums.
Opening the freezer. What a clever cat.
Clever, super fat cat. Anyway, naughty Monty. We're getting a couple of texts from bakers about FYI what temperature bread gets baked
excellent.
at. Between 200 and 240 degrees, says one person.
Wow.
Someone else says bread ovens heat between 190 to 220 degrees, depending on the style of bread.
That's astonishing because, okay, I've been, my knowledge has been twisted because I've been looking at proteins in the human body and proteins closely related to the human body, and didn't consider the proteins in bread, which seem to be stable up to really high temperatures. The question is, they can be stable up to 200 and still set off a reaction, the gluten in the bread, the proteins, in somebody with celiac disease. The question is, can they still do it if they're at 300? If they've actually been charred and burnt a bit, does that damage the proteins, change the shape so they no longer set off the immune system reaction?
Hey, Dr. Ben from Dapto, what is your science question for Dr. Karl this morning?
The question that I have today is, when having a shower, I would think that the pores in your body fill with water. The question that I've got is, after having a shower, if there's still water in the pores of my body, does that mean I weigh more after having a shower?
Yes, we definitely know that the sweat glands, which have the little pores in them, work in both directions. So certainly, if you're working hard, if it's a hot day, you'll sweat outwards. And on the other hand, if you stay in a bath or in the water for a long time at the ocean, the water will go in, dilute the local saltiness of the tissues that are immediately around the inside of the sweat gland, and set off a sympathetic nervous system response, which will then make your skin wrinkle as the blood supply is reduced. So we know from that experiment that water can go in. So there'd be a microscopic amount of water. It wouldn't be a thousandth of a litre, it'd be more around the millionths or maybe even billionths of a litre, but there would be microscopic amounts of water in your sweat glands immediately after having a shower or bath.
But you wouldn't be able to tell if I stood on the scale before the shower and after a shower?
Well, we can measure things very, very accurately, but the trouble is that as you breathe in and out, you'll create a little bit of a shaking on the scales, and just if you stood dead still, I think you still got your heart beating. So when your heart beats, the blood pumps upwards. So if you've got very sensitive scales, you can see that when the blood pumps upwards, the scales register a fraction higher. But you've got to have scales that measure down into the milligrams or millions of a gram. There was a field of knowledge back in the 60s, but they couldn't get the technology cheap enough. Now the technology is very cheap, and people are looking at that as another way of doing diagnostics with the heart. So theoretically it's possible. Don't know if it's been done.
Speaking of the body, Dr. Eric from Newtown in New South Wales, what's your science question?
So I got my spleen taken out a couple of years ago, and for the next couple of months, every time I'd roll over, I'd feel all my insides shifting, obviously because there was a big hole where my spleen used to be, and then it sort of disappeared over a couple of months. I just wondered what takes the space.
Well, it's not so much a hole as in a place where there's air inside. So from the bottom of your lungs, the top of your legs, you've got the cavity known as the peritoneal cavity, and I don't think there's any air in there. You can force in there. So for example, with women, you can go straight through the vagina, uterus, and out through the fallopian tubes and puff air, if you wanted to, into the peritoneal cavity. But I don't think in men there's a direct communication with the outside world, and the air would be resorbed. So I think just the internal organs shifted around, and the ligaments that tend to hold the organs in place were probably damaged and then healing, and that might have been what you were feeling. But I don't think there'd be actually an air gap. However, in your the tube that runs through your gut, which is 10 metres long, altogether running from your mouth to the bottom end, your gastrointestinal tract, that has air and fluid levels inside it. So there's definitely air in there. But where the spleen was, there wouldn't be just like a gap where there'd be air. I really doubt that.
So what ends up happening? The other organs just move
sort of
in
shift
and take
around.
its place. Would your external body shape change if something?
Microscopically, very little, but it's up high underneath the left-hand rib cage, so it would be hard to get at.
Wow. So just before, Dr. Karl, we were talking to Dr. Linda about how she has a bit of a fat cat, and that cat, I think Lulu was its name, had started snoring recently, and we were trying to figure out exactly why, and you said that sometimes it can be due to being overweight.
And so the loose tissue in the airways flutters like a flag in a breeze.
Dr. Rob, you are an official vet, you are our consultant. What do you reckon?
It sounds like a pretty good gig. How you going, guys?
Hi.
I just between jobs and heard the segment and thought I'll just text in for you, but yeah, wasn't probably expecting a call, so I'm in there now. But
there you go.
All good. Those snoring cats, they if it's a younger cat, it might be breed related. We see the pushed-in nose breeds, which we call brachycephalics, where they've got the short noses and they have altered airway anatomy. So Persian cats, for example, and in dogs we see French bulldogs and boxers, those types of guys, pugs, they will naturally snore and have altered breathing sounds and patterns because of the altered airway structure.
Okay, so whether they're young or old or fat or skinny, these cats and dogs with these squashed-in noses, with the altered shapes, they will tend to be snoring anyway. And what about a regular cat that then gets a bit fat, and does that have a slight tendency to increase its snoring?
Yeah, it definitely can, Dr. Karl. That's a possibility, and we do see that as well, and same in overweight dogs. But if it's not a young cat and they're people that, have breeds that do have normal airway structure, the other thing that can cause these sounds is allergies as well. Sometimes they can get swelling around the soft palate at the back of the throat, or other structures around there if it's like a new thing for a cat that hasn't had it before.
What sort of allergies does a cat have?
It's funny, sometimes we don't really know the causes, but certainly people move houses or adopt a cat, so there's an environmental change. They can be as multiple as us. There can be something from the environment, pollens. I actually had a dog that was allergy tested when I worked in the UK, and it came back allergic to cats, so I suppose cats might also be able to be allergic to dogs. I don't know.
Hey, how about this? Humans can be allergic to cats. Can cats be allergic to humans?
Oh, well, it's probably a possibility. I'm not sure. It's not something we're aware of, but I pretty much don't discount anything these days. It's a possibility.
Wow. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rob.
Thank you, Dr. Rob. Dr. Sophie in Adelaide, jumping to a different subject. What's your question for Dr. Karl?
Hi, doctors. I'm so excited to be here. I'm such a big fan, Dr. Karl.
Who is it?
I'm so nervous. I was reading Stephen Hawking's latest book, and he discussed how computer viruses are like real living viruses. And I'm certainly no biologist, but I was just wondering how that actually works.
Okay, so a bit of a background. He is on the spectrum with regard to artificial intelligence of thinking that once the intelligence is able to modify itself and start doing stuff without us, that it should be able to modify itself faster than we can and could be a potential threat to us in the future. That's his thinking. Now, separately from that, let's talk about the issue of it being a virus. And the best way to do that is to look at a virus and a bacterium in the biological sense and then compare them. So suppose you've got a backyard swimming pool and it's just got water in it, a whole lot of absolutely pure water, plus fats, proteins and carbohydrates. So it's got potential food in there, and all of the minerals, iron, zinc, magnesium, whatever, that a bacterium would need. Well, you put one bacterium in there and 2 minutes later you've got 20, and then every 20 minutes it doubles until finally you've got a swimming pool chock full of bacteria. Okay, go back to the same swimming pool and put in a virus, and nothing happens. The virus is potentially alive, but it needs a special environment, and that environment is inside another living creature, which can be a bacterial cell or a human cell or a dog cell, but it can only do its stuff if it's already inside another cell. So it falls into that area that first year medical students always get arguments about, is a virus alive or dead? And it's alive in the sense that it can make copies of itself, and that it can mutate, and it can go towards things that it wants and avoids things that it doesn't like, but it's not alive in the sense that if you chuck it in a swimming pool full of food and water, it does nothing. It needs a living creature. So in the same way, a computer virus can be alive in the sense that it can change if it's a really smart one, and it can mutate, but it needs a special environment which is inside the computer, inside the software and the hardware, and then it runs around inside there. So is a computer virus alive? Yes, in the same sense that a regular virus is alive, but it needs a special environment. The thing is that environment is some sort of electronic thing with electrons feeding it, as opposed to sugar and fats and proteins.
But he wasn't alluding to the fact that it was a real living virus that would jump from an electronic sense to a physical.
Whoa, not yet. Not yet, but I can see a nice science fiction story on that. A nice movie
I'm loving it. Sophie, you ready to write a screenplay or what?
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm doing engineering, so that's probably not my forte.
You can figure it out.
Yeah,
Outbreak,
you have the background
Part 2.
for it. There are books on how to learn how to write screenplays, and that's a really good idea, Sophie. Go for it.
Thanks for your call, Dr. Sophie. Dr. Justin in Druin, Victoria. You were trying to figure out a rumour. What's your science question for Dr. Karl?
Okay, so my wife and I were discussing whether a spoon put in the top of a bottle of champagne would actually stop that bottle of champagne from losing its fizziness.
I've run this past the chief chemist at Moet and Chandon, and it's not Moet and Chandon, it's Moet because it's a Belgian company, not French, or it's a Belgian person, and that's Professor Gerard Leger-Belair, who in the December 1999 issue of the Scientific American solved the problem of where the bubbles come from and how they can form. And it's not that simple. And he is quite adamant that it makes no difference, and he's the sort of person who's done the experiments, and when he wants to do experiments he can order several cubic meters of champagne bottles on pallets.
Yeah, sure, experiments.
Yeah. I've been to their place underground, and they got 20 kilometres of tunnels with 20 million bottles of champagne down there. Huge. So that's in Epinay in France. So overwhelmingly, whenever the experiment has been done, the spoon across or in the mouth of the champagne bottle makes no difference to it keeping bubbles. So how come the rumour has started? Because champagne is more viscous than soda water and beer. So with soda water, it loses its bubbles fairly quickly. Beer actually hangs onto its bubbles a bit longer than soda water, but champagne is more viscous again, more gluey, a bit like honey, and it's got other chemicals in it, so it hangs onto its bubbles really well. And so you have it the next day and you think, gee, it still tastes good, there's still bubbles in it, it must be because I put the spoon in the mouth, but if you put the spoon in the mouth or not, it makes no difference.
Does the spoon thing work for any first? No, it doesn't.
Not unless you've got some sort of special magical spell, Game of Thrones, invoking dragons, but there's no laws of physics by which it would work, and every experiment that's been done shows that it doesn't work. I'm sorry, Dr. Justin.
Well, we can save your spoons, it's fine. Thanks for your call, Dr. Justin. Dr. Kitty from DY in New South Wales, what's your science question?
Hello, doctors. Well, this has been a curiosity for some time now, and I've observed it in myself and in others. When I wake up in the morning, I don't have any creases on my body, but if I lie in bed for a little bit longer, then I get creases on my body. Same thing happens if I have a like a little nap during the day and I'm not fully asleep.
So, Linda?
I get the same thing.
Yeah,
so every day I wake up in the morning and I'm fine, I've got no creases on my body at all, but if I happen to conk out watching a movie or doing something, I will wake up and I will have like weird pillow marks on my face or across my arm or on my legs from my bed sheets or something.
Wow.
Isn't that so weird?
I think I have noticed that, but I didn't document it with photographs, silly me, but anecdotally, I think that's correct. If anybody's got an answer to that one, please
I don't know
ring in
why
or
it
text
is.
in.
It's almost like I feel heavier when I have a nap. So it's like I'm hitting it harder or something.
Yeah, like when I look in the face in the morning, there's no major creases, but when I've had a little nap for half an hour, there are. You sort of, I don't know why. I don't know why.
Good question though,
okay,
Dr.
so
Kitty.
you can tweet at Dr. Karl, DRKARL, if you've got an answer for that, or if you've got something in the peer-reviewed literature, we'd love to know the answer.
Liam from Rhod in New South Wales, hopefully we can answer your one. What's your one, Dr. Liam?
I've just got a question about humans' body temperatures. Now, when we're healthy and comfortable, our temperature of our body is around 36.5, 37.5 degrees. But we're most comfortable when it's about 23 degrees, 14 degrees cooler than our body temperature. And when it's 37 degrees outside, we're overheating and sweating. So I just want to know the science behind that.
It goes back to Newton's law of cooling, which says that the amount of heat you lose depends on the temperature difference between what's hot and the environment. If your internal temperature is 37, if the external temperature is 37, there's no reason for the heat to travel across. And yet you're generating heat continuously at the rate of about 100 watts. 100 watts of heat you're generating all the time, about 1/5 of that from your head. And so you will gradually overheat. You get too hot, you go from 37 to 38, and then you'll begin, because there's a difference of 38 on the inside, 37 on the outside, you'll lose a tiny, tiny amount of heat. But that's really dangerous, and so you start to sweat. So you need that difference in temperature between your skin, between your core and the outside world, for you to be able to lose heat comfortably. And it's kind of said in the air conditioning books that around 20 degrees centigrade is considered normal shirt sleeve environment, where you can sort of work around virtually naked and not feel hot and not feel cold. It varies for the individual person, but you need that temperature gradient for the heat to leave your body, because you're always generating heat. You're always generating heat all the time, so you've got to get rid of it. And so you need a sink at lower temperature to dump it into.
Great. Hey, you know how we were talking earlier as well about baking bread?
Yes.
So we had Nick, who was a chef, that called in and was wondering about when he was baking bread in like a big pizza oven.
Yep.
And then the bread would turn to carbon, and whether
it'd be the
those
burnty blacky bits,
little burnty blacky bits, and whether that would affect someone who's a celiac.
Yeah, would it set them off?
Yeah, would it set them off if they had a little bit of that on the food he then served them that was cooked on the same surface? Jackson from Canberra, you are studying food science. You reckon you might have some sort of insight?
Yeah, I've read about this. I'm doing my PhD in food science, and so firstly, browning's caused by Maillard reaction, which is a browning caused by a reduction of sugars. Now, when you're talking about gluten specifically, I just did a bit of pub scholaring just then to confirm it. But in gluten, you'll have different molecules. Gliadin is one of them, and they'll be broken down at certain temperatures. So essentially, you need to isolate all the little molecules found within gluten that make it up for gluten, and then heat them all up. and then run a bunch of tests to figure out if they've all been destroyed. And in theory, you could eat the brown bits and you'd be alive.
Okay, so certainly when bread gets heated up to 220 degrees in the oven to make the bread, the various proteins do not get broken down. But what happens when you go up to 300 degrees in a really hot pizza oven? Does that break down the various proteins that are there that make up the gluten?
It depends. If your pizza just turned to ash, you could argue yes, but then you need to. I can't find any papers at the moment. I'm here with my uni supervisor, and we can't find any papers to support it just yet. So I'd say don't try it, but it is plausible.
Ah, so maybe this could be an Ig Nobel Prize effort for the future.
Experiment Jackson. We're talking science with Dr. Karl on TripleJ. Dr. Martin from Melbourne. What's your science question for Karl?
Hello. I have a question regarding the moon, the full moon. So for the past 10 years, my mother and grandmother, they have this theory people go absolutely nuts when the full moon's out. I've been looking this up, but I really wanted Dr. Karl to clarify this. I just wanted to find out if the full moon actually changes anything in the mind or the energy of humans or animals.
Well, Marty, it's never been proven. When you do a small study, in the sense that you look out the window and you say, gee, there's a full moon, and look, isn't the emergency department busy, therefore both are related, you do find a result. But when you do the big studies, where you look at every single hospital admission to a country over a period of 10 years, you do not find peaks on the full moon. And you find the same situation, in other words, there's no correlation, with calls to police and admissions to psychiatric wards. There's no blip on the full moon. So I think this is a case where we have to follow the example of the Mythbusters. The difference between science and screwing around is that in science you write it down. So if you just sort of think that it's always busy but you don't write it down, you'll get that wrong thought in your head and you'll just keep on reinforcing it.
Well, thank you for your call, Dr. Martin. Dr. Karl, you look so unsatisfied.
Oh, I just feel sorry that I've broken his heart.
I don't know, you could just make up things.
No.
Make up things for Dr. Allison in Brisbane in Queensland. What's your question, Dr. Allison?
Hi guys, I just had a question. I was driving along with a colleague the other day and we came across some rain, and some of the raindrops were really, really fat while others were just tiny little raindrops, and we were just wondering, why is that?
I'm not a meteorologist, but for I remember from having spoken to them, you have up currents, and so if you've got the raindrops just falling down and there's not a strong up current, you'll have these fairly small raindrops. The raindrops have each got a tiny nucleus or particle of dirt in them, which helps them condense out of the humid air, and they fall down. If there's an up current, they'll start coming down and then they get blown up, and then they run into more raindrops and they go up and down, and the more strong the wind is, the more the number of cycles they go through before finally their weight is great enough to overcome the updraft. So that's when you'll get the big fat drops. Now, this is what I was told by a meteorologist some years ago. I could have it wrong, but that is what is the best thing I've got in my mind, but it could be wrong.
Looks like they're dancing when
They're dancing up and down, and you find the same thing with the ice cores. When there's hail, you can definitely then get a sharp knife and cut the hail, and you can see the different shells a millimetre or two thick.
Wow.
So that means there's 5 of them, it's been up and down 5 times.
Earlier in this hour, we were talking to Dr. Kitty, and she was asking about why is it that when she wakes up in the morning, she's got no kind of creases on her body. She wakes up and she's
been lying on her skin for hours and hours.
She looks normal. But if she falls asleep or dozes off for a few minutes at a time, she'll wake up and she's got like creases in her arms or on her legs or on her face or something. I find the exact same thing, and she was saying she found it with other friends. Someone has texted in, this kind of makes sense. A theory for napping and body creases. Similar to when you fall asleep when you're drunk, your body is overtired and you don't have the automatic reaction to turn over, reducing the pressure on your body.
True, but you don't do a lot of turning in 10 minutes, and there would be a time when you're asleep at night where you wouldn't move for 10 minutes at a time. I can see what they're saying. There might be something different with the blood supply to the skin when you're in full, proper, rested sleep, as opposed to just having fallen asleep from exhaustion, having a nap in the middle of the day. There's something going on. We're getting closer. I haven't got there yet.
Okay, Dr. Tim from Broken Hill in New South Wales. What's your science question?
Hello, Dr. Karl and Dr. Linda. How are you?
Good, Dr. Tim.
Ever since I can remember, Dr. Karl, I've had a very weak stomach when it comes to seeing other people spewing, also known as sympathy spewing. My 3-year-old was very sick one night, obviously vomiting everywhere, and I couldn't deal with it. I had to get my wife to come and help out. I'd actually leave the room and because I was getting really sick. When it comes to blood, I can handle it. My blood and someone else's blood, no problem. But when it comes to spewing, I don't know how to overcome it. Can you beat it, Dr. Karl?
You can, but there is an advantage to having this shared or sympathy spewing. So if you and the tribe have all had roughly the similar sort of meal, and one of you starts vomiting, then it makes sense that the rest of you all vomit, so that at least one or two of you will survive. So the bad chemical in the food that you've eaten hasn't set you off to vomit yet, like it has with that other person. They're registering this as a bad thing, but if you vomited up earlier, you've got a better chance of surviving. So it's a wired-in reflex, like for some people, the reflex for catching a yawn from somebody. So that sort of increases group bonding. In this case, it increases group survival when you've eaten something bad. How do you get around it? There's different ways. I'm thinking cognitive behaviour therapy via a psychologist, and you could train yourself out of that. Although you'd have to, if you